this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Razer Viper V3 Pro. This is an interesting update to Razer's Viper lineup, which includes a mouse that on the face of it looks fairly understated, and yet hides a number of really nice features and specification enhancements. It's also interesting in that it's made of up to 85% recycled plastic, which not only makes it lightweight, but also potentially better for the environment than other mice. And you'll see it also has some nice changes to it with these large PTFE feet on the underside, the power and DPI switches under there too, and an ergonomic symmetrical shape which makes it fits nicely in the hand. You'll also see the side buttons have a large gap between them, which makes them nice and easy to feel and means you're less likely to misclick and have issues while gaming. There are a number of other things here that I've found particularly cool, like it has a really long battery life, for example, but it also comes with Razer's wireless Hyperpolling Dongle, which means that you can get up to 8,000 Hertz polling rate. Now, this was an additional purchase previously with other Razer mice, but now comes as standard. So instead of the usual 1,000 Hertz, you can go all the way up to 8,000, and you have a choice of 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 or 8,000 polling rate, which means that if you're playing sort of pro level games and you want to make the most of that, then you can do so. And you can adjust it within the software and switch between those modes. And there's an auto switching mode, and you can also change it so that it will focus on the battery life, because at 1,000 Hertz, you get a lot more battery life than you do at 8,000 Hertz. It goes all the way up to 95 hours at 1,000 Hertz, right down to 17 hours at 8,000 Hertz. So it depends how you're using it, what games you're playing, whether you want to crank it all the way up and make the most of it. If you're playing games like Valorant or Overwatch, for example, where accuracy matters and fast input is important to you, then you can enable things like raw input buffer or high precision mouse input in the settings of those games to make the most of this. And if you need to, when you need to, you can unplug it from the dongle and plug it straight into the mouse, which is slightly fiddly. But what I found is that you don't have to plug it in that often. Now, this is obviously going to vary depending on your use. But in my use case, I actually found I wasn't plugging it in very often at all. And it's really easy to see when you need to, because there's an LED indicator on the front of the mouse, which lets you know the battery life. But it also gives you a visual cue to the DPI levels. So when you press the button on the underside, you'll see that changes color, and that gives you an indication of what the DPI is currently set to. DPI goes all the way up to 35,000 at the top level, and this uses Razer's Focus Pro 35K optical sensor, which is Gen 2, and they claim a 99.8% resolution accuracy with that as well. It also has a low click latency, which is a claim of 0.461 milliseconds. So it is meant to be very responsive. One of the little subtle things that I like is both the mouse and the dongle have that visual indicator to let you know when the battery's running low as well. So you can see it flashing red here, and then you can just plug it in a hurry so that you've got battery on the go. But I didn't find I ever ran out of battery and the mouse wasn't working, because it was just indicated there immediately. Like other Razer mice, this thing is really lightweight at just 54 grams. And that's partly because of those lightweight plastics. But what I was impressed by is the fact that it's lightweight and yet still has a really decent battery life with it, because those two don't usually go hand in hand, because if you're trying to shed weight, then obviously you'd be reducing the internals. And the fact that it's got such large, slick feet make it really easy to flick around on the desk as well. Now, this has a good ergonomic shape to it, as you can see. It's got a slight raise on there for claw grip, but it's meant for fingertip grip and claw grip setup. So either of those, if that's your preference, then that's how you get on with it. As you can see, also has this grip tape included as standard. And when you put that on there, I think it looks a lot nicer. And it has that more snake-like finish to it, so it lives up to that Viper namesake, which then makes it look a bit meaner, and it's easy to grip onto. But I will say, obviously you can see it's got this kind of matte finish to it, very smooth as standard. But what I found is using it like that, it didn't feel like it was so slick that it was going to be a problem holding on to it in gaming, even if you've got like oily or sweaty hands. But if you do feel like you are particularly sweaty and oily, then you can slap these on as well. And even with those on, I do have pretty hot hands, and I haven't found there's been an issue with these getting dirty or marred overuse. I've been using it for a few weeks now, thoroughly enjoying it. And finding it hard to pick holes in it, to be honest. The other good news is if you're pretty clumsy like I am and you have a bit of a problem when installing the grip tape, you can actually easily remove it and replace it. So I got a couple of bubbles in there while I was doing it. I was able to pull it back off, put it back on again, and had no problems there. You will notice from the multiple angles here that there's a curve in the main buttons. So you can see there's a curve in the shape of those main buttons. So your fingers sit really nicely in those dips, and the side grips have that same sort of thing. So when you're holding onto it from the sides, you can also hold on to that really well as well. So I found the ergonomics fit really nicely in my hand, and it's very comfortable to use. Now with the addition of the grip tape, you don't actually end up adding loads of extra weight despite putting grip tape on both sides and on the main buttons. We're only looking at an extra couple of grams here at 56 grams. So it's still pretty lightweight and nippy. Now one of the nice things that I like, as you can see, is those side buttons, nice and large and a nice gap between them. So it's really easy to feel those. A lot of the problems you have with other mice, or they don't stick out far enough to be able to feel them, which can be the problem in the middle of a fight. Now I'm going to be quiet for a second so you can hear the mouse clicks and more, but then I also want to talk to you a bit more about the software and other things in a second, so stick with me. As you can hear, those clicks are pretty crispy, and that's Razer's Optical Gen-3 switches, which means they're really responsive and accurate, and they're also guaranteed up to 90 million clicks. I found that whole experience to be really satisfying in that regard as well. Now, it's not going to make you a better gamer necessarily, and I'm certainly no pro gamer, but I have found that I've been getting on really well with this mouse, and I haven't had any problems with the response from it. Razer does recommend keeping the Hyperpolling Dongle within a 30cm distance of the mouse and away from other wireless sources. However, I use a wireless headset, and there are other wireless things nearby, and I've certainly had no problems with a signal dropout or any issues in that regard. So it's just been going really well across the board. Now, obviously, if you're cranking up the polling rate to make the most of it, you are going to reduce the battery life quite significantly, and that's one of the negative impacts. But under sort of general use, if you're playing more casual games occasionally, like probably you wouldn't want to crank 8,000 hertz polling rate on Fortnite necessarily, then it doesn't matter quite so much, and your battery will just keep going and going. And that's what I've found, is the battery life's really good in that setup there. It's also just been very comfortable and not had any issues in that regard. And I do feel like I've been able to hit my shots even in new releases like Grey Zone Warfare, where there's stability and stuttering issues. So I'm still managing to be accurate in this somehow. However, a mouse isn't going to save you from the inevitable death that comes with being overwhelmed by baddies. Now, if we take a quick look at the software, I'll show you some of the other things you can do with it and get into that. One of the first things I discovered on plugging the Viper V3 Pro in is you do get a notification about firmware update, which for some reason is done with a separate tool outside of Synapse, which means that you don't necessarily need to download Synapse, although you probably will because you want to adjust the polling rate within there. But you get this notification. And I've actually had a couple of updates to the firmware, so they're obviously pushing updates to make it even better since launch, so it's worth checking as well. And it'll update both the mouse and the Hyperpolling wireless dongle too. In Razer's Synapse software, you'll see you have a few different things that you can change. Obviously, you can program the buttons, so you can reprogram the buttons as necessary, including changing the DPI button on the underside and the side buttons and other things. And obviously, you also have all the usual adjustment in here. So you can see, for example, you can disable buttons you don't want to use. You can set it to launch programs. You can set up with Razer's Hypershift, which, if you don't know, Razer's Hypershift is an extra layer of button presses. So you press one button on the mouse and then you can assign another layer to the button. If you press on this Hypershift action here, for example, you'll be able to set up things in there. So you can press and hold on the button that you set. So if we set, for example, mouse button 4 to hyper shift. Then when you hold that mouse button forward, it'll put it into this additional mode, and then in there you can then reprogram these things so it'll do other things. So you could set a sensitivity clutch, for example, on the front mouse button. So if you hold the rear one and then the front one, it sets the mouse to really low DPI temporarily, and then you can just release those buttons and you're back to being on a higher DPI. And so that gives you the ability to add more buttons theoretically to the setup. In the middle here, you'll see you can also set the indicator LED on the Hyperpolling dongle, so you can actually get at a glance a look at how much battery life you've got left. Now, this is actually really useful because for me personally, for example, I set my dongle just in front of the mouse, just off the mouse mat, so it's not in the way. But that means that's really easy to glance at and see what the current battery life is, whereas the indicator on the front of the mouse is sort of out of view if your hand's on top of it, because you wouldn't necessarily see. So you can get a much easier view of how much battery you've got left. And you can change the settings on here, so you can set it so it's battery warning only, or you can set it so it will just show the current connection status. But this is the default battery status, and I've actually found that really handy. Under the performance section, you can change between 5 levels of DPI, as said, going all the way up to 35,000 if you want to, and you can switch between these with the mouse button on the underside. And then you have your polling rate, which you can set as standard. So for example, you might set it to 1000 Hertz polling rate as standard to save battery life. So if you're just doing productivity things like editing videos, for example, or just surfing the web in Windows, you don't need 8000 Hertz when you're doing that, but then you can set it so it will automatically switch to 8000 Hertz when you're playing games. That way you can extend the battery life and still make the most of those higher settings, which is pretty neat. And then you've got some power settings for wireless battery saving, 5 minutes as the default, and low power mode. Now with these settings, I've not found any issues with power drain being ridiculous, and I've barely had to plug it in, which has been really nice. And then you also have an option to calibrate according to your mouse surface. So as you can see, lots of things to like about this mouse, and overall it is definitely one I feel comfortable recommending. It's been a good fit for me, and I've got on really well with it, and it's very hard to find any holes in it. The price, however, might put some people off, and that's something to bear in mind. But if you're looking for a really good mouse that in theory should last quite a long time and will be accurate, responsive, and give you good specs, then this is the one to look at. Let me know in the comments what you think, and thanks very much for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.